I wrote this book, A Theory of Everyone, which, contrary to what Tim says, is a modest title. Could have been A Theory of Everything. I restricted myself to everyone. It's a play on, a theory of everything in physics, which is this attempt to connect the physics of the very vast, general relativity, to the physics of the very small, quantum mechanics. And what I argue in the book is that we've made these breakthroughs in the human and social sciences that allow us to make that connection between the kind of micro and the macro that makes sense of an otherwise chaotic and confusing world. In the first half of the book, what I go through is what that theory looks like. And this is a real failure of mine. This is a classic kind of Ivy League thing. Everybody asks me, well, what is the theory? What is the theory? What do you mean by a theory? And I want to be very clear that the word theory here is used in the scientific sense. So I'm talking about really a network of mathematical models and evidence for them. But if I were to kind of describe, the theory in a few words, it is to say that to understand humans is to understand that a lot of our cognition is cultural software inherited from our societies, and it gives us entirely new abilities. And a lot of our innovation and cognitive processes are actually collective. It's a process of learning from one another, ideas meeting in a kind of collective brain and new things emerging. Such that we now live in a world that not even the smartest among us could recreate. Like the chair that you're sitting on, you could spend your entire life recreating it, figuring out how to mine that ore, turn it into metal, forge it into that frame, so there is a supply chain of millions of people and generations upon generations just on that chair, let alone this world that we live in. The second half of the book, I ask people to say, look, take it at face value that we have something like a periodic table that allows us to move from alchemy to chemistry. Well, what does that mean for many of the problems that we face in the world? And what I'd like to do today is to focus on just a few things that I think might be useful in a South African context. I'm very aware of people just turning up on the continent and preaching from on high. I am about to do some of that, but I do want to say that this is actually from the introduction to my book. This is a photo I dug up of me in Botswana because I spent my childhood there. And these are my, three of my best friends actually, which reflect the South African flag, and actually a couple of them are South African. I spent my, as it says here, I spent most of my childhood in Botswana, South Africa's northern neighbor, and my memories are filled with the dusty streets of Gaborone, camping deep in the Kalahari Desert, under the unobstructed majesty of the Milky Way and the splendor of South Africa during the 90s. I love the beautiful plateaus of Table Mountain, framing the sprawl of Cape Town. I didn't know I was coming to Stellenbosch, just to be clear, when I wrote the book. As it makes to see the smell of fusion foods, biltong jerky. I still got a dealer in London. Braai barbecue, potjie kos stew, bunny chow curry, devoured on Durban's expansive beaches, and so on. Splashed across, I also remember the exhilaration and trepidation as South Africa transitioned from apartheid. Splashed across every television and newspaper was the powerful image of the last white Afrikaner president, a somber FW de Klerk, his face set against a faint smile next to the beaming new President Nelson Mandela, their arms raised and hands clasped together as they ushered in a new era filled with hope and uncertainty. The waters of the world may be very different, but we are all part of the same ocean. Now, the book isn't about South Africa, and this is probably one of the few places I don't have to put that picture up because you know exactly what I'm referring to. And it's been interesting for me, seeing things from afar and watching what happened post-apartheid, and I think the dreams of South Africa not fully realized. Okay, so one of the first insights, as I said, is that our cultural software is truly different. So most animals, when they encounter a new environment, genetically adapt to that environment. More fur and fat to deal with colder climates, for example. Now, humans have some genetic modifications. Human skin color, for example, is very well adapted to latitude. Because you need to synthesize vitamin D in your skin. As you go north, there's not enough sunlight. You got to lose the melanin to make sure you don't get vitamin D deficiency. And as you go south, you need to protect yourself from skin cancer, right? So if you're mismatched, you have to do these things. Now, but most of what we did was figure out how the world worked. Most of what we did was to figure out not how to get bigger brawn, but bigger brains, that we then applied to how to hunt the local predators and turn their skin into something we could wear to keep us warm instead of more fur and fat. And this is a stark example of this, right? This is to show you how culture and the environment shapes even low-level perception, and it's some new data, actually. So I want you to just put your hands up. If you can see, do you see rectangles in this picture? Or squares, if you like. Or do you see circles? Put your hand up if you see rectangles. And put your hand up if you see circles. And if you're like, the hell's going on? What do you mean circles? What are you talking about? So in fact, there are circles here and rectangles. Both of these can be viewed in this image. But it depends on what environment your visual system encountered to see how your software was shaped in perceiving your world. Okay? So we can see this by visiting sites. So I have a site that's primarily about education, but we're able to look at a rural-urban gradient at the Kunene region at the border between Namibia and Angola. Again, many of you may be familiar with this. The Himba people live on both sides of this river. We are dealing with an educational experiment where schools are being introduced on the south of this river, but not on the north. There's gene flow, there's culture flow, but a big institutional difference, and we can identify what's going on there. If you do this kind of work, you got to put a picture of yourself up there. This is me and my son at one of these villages. It's more impressive outside of Southern Africa, I promise you. And one of the things we look at in this urban-rural gradient is how the environment shapes something like this. When we ask people, who live in rural environments and have lived all their lives, what they say is, I see circles. And just to show you how culture can blind you to seeing things the way another person can see it, we asked this woman, what do you see? And instead of saying circles, as most of the participants did, she said, I see houses. And we're like, whoa, this is weird. You're saying you see houses? What do you mean by that? And then she said, can you point to them? And she's pointing at all the circles. And we said, can you draw? And so of course she draws her house, which is circular, right? But for my Western-trained RAs running this experiment, or postdocs rather, they were just like, oh, right, the houses here are circular, right? Culture shapes the way that you view the world. When we run this experiment in the US and UK, 80% of people see only rectangles, and a further 17% see rectangles and eventually see circles, and only 3% see circles first. And it's the opposite if you look in these villages, right? 48% see only circles, and a further 48% see circles and the rectangles, and the 1 or 2 people who see rectangles first actually had some exposure to an urban environment. These results are so stark, I couldn't run normal statistics on them. Right? I ran a Bayesian model, and then I had to add a few numbers here just so that the model could stabilize. Right? It's that crazy. I'm going to help you see it now. All right? Here it is. I've circled some of the circles. Can you see them now? You see it? Yeah? So people around the world literally see the world differently. Can you put your hand up just to make sure you can see the circles, folks? Okay, good. You can see them now. Look, it's not a different image. The circles are still here. Yeah? Okay. People around the world literally see the world differently. Culture runs deep, right? It affects your values, your assessment. It affects your cognition, how you think about the world. Culture is the software of our minds, and if we are to understand human behavior, the idea of like a Newtonian universality, you can just pick anywhere from any place and we're all the same, is actually incorrect. That is not what makes us so different to other animals. What makes us so different to other animals is that we are the product of millions of years of genetic evolution as a primate that evolved right here in Africa. And we have instincts, just as every other animal does, but we are also the product of thousands of years of cultural evolution, highly adapted to local environments, and a short lifetime of fine-tuning, if you like, of life experience. And that's really what makes us so different. So when you look at something like IQ, right, it's very difficult to change IQ with training, but one form of training that really does shape things is education. This is a natural experiment from Norway. Norway has compulsory military service, and they also measure IQ. They had an educational reform in the mid-20th century where they added an extra 2 years of education, and you can clearly see that the regression discontinuity here. It added about 7 IQ points or something like that, 3.5 per year, and that's on the tail end of things, right? That's on the tail end of things. In a large meta-analysis of, 142 effect sizes, 42 data sets, and 600,000 participants, the conclusion was that education appears to be the most consistent, robust, and durable method yet to be identified for raising intelligence, right? Education is not just this emancipatory thing, it's not just this freeing thing, it is a specific cultural download, an efficient way to apply the factory model to create factory workers post-industrial revolution. And we all live in a world where we're exposed to it, so it's very difficult to understand what is human and what is delivered by this system, where like what you guys are doing right now is weird, right? Like sitting down and listening to a person standing in front of you, you got like 12, well you guys actually got like 24 years or something of experience doing this, right? But it's hard. It trains patience, it increases your time horizons, and it's a delivery. It's like, listen kids, phonemes, numbers, counting, reading, and so on. On and on, we're going to download this software. So just to hammer this point home, let me show you an example. You might assume that humans can count, because you can count. And most everyone you know can count. But in fact, many societies in history, and in fact many small-scale societies today, count like this. 1, 2, 3, many. And it's not because there's something genetically strange about them. It is that they don't have that cultural download or didn't have that app, if you like, right? And there's different counting systems around the world. But when we extended beyond the 1, 2, 3, many, we did it in a couple of ways. One is with objects like stones or pressed into clay to make marks, right? And another is with body parts. Calculus, for example, comes from the calcium in stones. With body parts, and we count in a decimal system, but there's nothing unique about the number 10. It's in fact a terrible number system. I would have much rather lost a finger to get 8 or 16 so that I could map back to binary. 10 is terrible. But we're able to kind of map that back. But even once we did that, some concepts are very difficult to convey, and so it took centuries to culturally evolve. One of those is the concept of zero. And we only know this because of the historical record, right? Where is 0 on my body? How do you show someone 0 stones? Because 0 is nothing, and nothing is, well, it's nothing, right? So it takes a very long time for 0 to be recognized as a number, let alone negative numbers, which, as Francis Mesri's, the Canadian-British, they were the same thing at the time, mathematician said, negative numbers darken the very whole doctrines of the equations, right up until, 17th, 18th century. And the reason is we didn't have an app to be able to download it. Does anyone know what that mental model that enabled humans to more easily understand 0 and negative numbers was? But beyond stones and body parts, does anyone know? We do it with children today. We still use this. It's the number line. So we moved away from objects to movement and position. And that made 0 obvious, and it also made negative numbers so obvious that we could now teach it to children. And now it's a new baseline of knowledge that every generation builds up on, because no matter how old you are in the audience, it's a fairly young audience, the first thing you had to do was to catch up on the last several thousand years of human history, and actually a very narrow sliver of it, because you're ignorant about many, many things. In Namibia and Angola, we collected data on this at this kind of border experiment. We used what we consider to be kind of the cutting edge of, or what many people consider to be the cutting edge of culture-free IQ tests, simply because it doesn't use numbers or words. But of course, as you saw, shapes are something we teach. Oh, I should be very clear. The hypothesized reason for why you see rectangles and they see circles is that sharp corners are not common in the natural world. And if you live in an urban environment, you encounter them and your visual system begins to interpret them, and you know what they also know what rectangles are, but you're used to identifying them. Whereas in a natural environment, curves are the norm, right? And when we run this experiment, what we find is that, look, we re-norm IQ tests because we assume kids are getting smarter with age. In fact, it's flat if you don't have access to education over in Angola, and it goes up with the age gradient as it does in the West because you're getting a dosage of schooling, which is improving your abilities even on this kind of culture-free IQ test. But it's not just IQ. So here's an example. So in the 1920s, Alexander Luria, the Russian psychologist, he went out to Uzbekistan where an educational revolution was happening. And he asked people questions that were like if P then Q reasoning, right? We assume that man is a rational animal sometimes, right? That we can reason. Of course we can reason, but it's not a natural thing to do. We normally have a very grounded way of reasoning. This is actually this is a book, and you can see my hand holding this, because when I was reading this, I was like, are you crazy? Is this true? Right? Here's an example. He asked people things like this. In the north there is snow and all the bears are white. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north. What color are the bears there? All of you are thinking white. I checked with my 6-year-old and she said white. This is what people without education, they said, I don't know. I've never been to the far north. I saw a black bear here once. It was a black. Right? That's a grounded reasoning, not a kind of abstract if P then Q. Now obviously humans are capable of doing this. But it's something that's delivered to us by our education system. And then once everyone has that baseline of knowledge, it becomes part of the fabric of society. Our media and TV shows become more complicated as we reach a higher and higher baseline. In the 1960s, we watched I Love Lucy, right? And Wham Bam Batman. And think about how complicated even the trashiest of TV shows have become, with convoluted storylines and multiple characters, let alone the equivalents of those shows like, I don't know, Rick and Morty or something, or The Dark Knight or Avengers or something, far more complicated. We find the same effect, right? On these tests, we ask people, I have this I have a boat, in this other country, people make boats out of sand. I have a boat from this other country. What's it made out of? They say wood. And you say, could it be made out of sand? And they laugh at you because that's so absurd, right, that you would even think or answer in that way. Final example of this, right? So if I were to ask you to read to say the colors here, it's easy. Blue, you just play along with me. Blue, yellow, red. But if it's mismatched, it's harder to say the color. You'll end up saying blue. You have to think for a second and then say red, and so on. Now, if I was an economist or a psychologist from Venus, I guess, like the anthropologist from Mars, we need our own planet, and if I came down to Earth and I measured humans and I saw this, what's called the Stroop test, I would say humans have a natural instinct for reading, but not color perception. That would be my conclusion. And the only reason we know otherwise is because of history. Right? We just know the history of literacy, and we know how hard it is to teach our children. But there's so much more that you were taught, much of which underlies successful democracies and successful trust-based economies. So many institutions rest on invisible cultural pillars. Slight jab at the recent Nobel Prize. Good institutions, yes, but good institutions rely on good cultural pillars, and we need to identify both of those things. So, one more jab and then I'll call it a day. Sometimes, and I do this with my colleagues, so forgive me, but I like to think that so economics emerged out of largely assumptions about human behavior grounded in 19th century philosophy, and it was highly formalized. And I think it actually does a pretty good job of modeling things. Yeah. In the same way, however, that the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, with the Earth in the center, and all the sun and all the other planets orbiting the Earth, was also a highly predictive model, right? It's the wrong model, and so you get crazy predictions of the Nash equilibrium, and then you're like, how do I fix that? Oh, behavioral economics. What if, okay, fine, people don't contribute to the public goods game, they're giving non-zero contributions. Why? Maybe we have inequity aversion. Let's put an epicycle to correct the fact that in reality, a couple of insights had to emerge. One is that the sun was in the center. This is the Copernican model. And I get why people rejected the Copernican model, because the Copernican model, although it put the sun at the center, it wasn't much more predictive, and it still had these epicycles, because Copernicus thought God loved circles, and he didn't realize that the orbits were elliptical, as Kepler put it. But once you get the right model, everything comes into relief. It suddenly makes sense. And that insight is to say that we live in a world in which institutions are really hardened cultural norms, in which much of our cognition that we consider human is culturally transmissible, and that means the scope of flexibility is far greater than we measure. Because what we measure is just what everyone has and not what could be. The things we're bad at are often the things that are simply not taught. So that's dual inheritance theory and cultural evolution, the kind of theory of everyone in a nutshell. So kind of going from there, saying, okay, fine, you say you've got this model that's a little bit more predictive of human behavior and social change. You say that this is like the move from alchemy to chemistry. What can I do with that, right? If you're right, what does that mean? What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong? Because even before the periodic table, we had gunpowder. We could do some stuff right. But before the periodic table, we were also trying to turn lead into gold. Even smart people like Newton were trying to turn lead into gold because we didn't know that the world was made of elements that couldn't be changed without a Large Hadron Collider or a star, right? The World Economic Forum says that we are in a polycrisis, right, where we have many different crises that are somehow connected to one another: economic, environmental, societal, technological, and geopolitical. But what was this, like a couple of 2022, 2023. Right, this map is from. I think South Africa knew about a polycrisis before that. There are connections between all these things. There can be root causes, and to understand that, we need multiple disciplines to come to the table, right? Because every discipline sees, it's a little bit like you go to the doctor, and different doctors will tell you a different part of the system is broken. It's the classic story of the blind men and the elephant, right? So, maybe the politicians say, look, it looks like a wall. Right? The economists say it looks like a rope. The psychologists say it looks like a snake and so on. They're feeling different parts of the elephant, but you have to put the thing together to see the elephant in the room. And if you don't do that, if you don't see the system, you risk making what I call cane toad or cobra effects. A cane toad effect are where small changes have an unintended negative effect on the system because you weren't thinking about the spillovers. Has anyone been to Australia? Yeah, a few people. What do you know about Australian immigration? What do they check for? Not cane toads, but well, cane toads too, but everything. They check for everything, right? You can't bring wood into the country. You can't bring the apple you're eating on the plane into the country. The reason is because, in the early 20th century, the Australian sugarcane industry was booming, but they had a problem, and that was the cane beetle. It was called the cane beetle because it loved the cane, the sugar cane, and it was stunting the plants. And so the Australians saw a problem, and they saw a natural solution. We need a predator to eat these beetles. So they flew over 101, not Dalmatians, but these ugly cane toads from Hawaii, and they let them loose, and they said, go, eat the cane toads. The cane toad is poisonous from tadpole to toadlet to toad. It's poisonous at every stage. It has wreaked havoc on the Australian ecosystem, right? Even crocodiles, if they eat a cane toad, the crocodile dies, right? There's over 1 billion, I think it is now at this point, just hopping across the continent. They're a real pest. Australia learned that lesson. They said, we're not going to do that again. It had these unintended consequences on the ecosystem. Moving back to kind of an economic approach, cobra effects. Maybe you guys know this story already. Does anyone know? So in India, cobras were a problem. Apparently, Johanna has the same problem in his house, cobras. I don't know if he wants to implement what the British did in India, which is to say they would pay people if they could kill these cobras, and they would have to just bring them the head, and then they would pay them. Yeah? The cobra population disappeared. It shrunk. But the British found, this is a classic economic approach, right? Just incentivize people to solve the problem. So the cobras disappeared. The British found they were still paying for cobra heads. So what gives? What's going on? Do you know what happened? Yeah, they were breeding the cobras. They're breeding the cobras, right? So the Brits were like, okay, that's it. No more cobra heads. So they just released the cobras, and the problem was bigger and worse than it was before. Right? This is often what systems do, right? I mean, in politics, you see a problem. Look, there's inequality between different ethnic groups. Let's fix it. Let's patch it with this. We'll patch with this. But that creates an entire new industry, a suboptimal industry with all kinds of negative externalities that are actually more harmful than if you had gotten to the root cause and tackled it by understanding what's going on in the system. A big part of the book, I introduced what I call 4 laws of life. Please forgive me, they're not Newtonian laws. It's a popular book. They're more like lenses, if you like, but the 4 lenses of life sounds boring, so they're the 4 laws of life. They are what I consider to be kind of the levers that help us explain this system, and they are the laws of energy, the law of innovation, the law of cooperation, the law of evolution. And it was this graph, so I work on cooperation, it's a big part of my portfolio, and it was this graph that I was obsessing over, right? It just kept me up at night. I was like, what's going on here? All of these things that you learned about in school as being very, very important. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Lushan Rebellion, Genghis Khan, Black Death. If you look at any metric of progress, there's a few here that Luke Muehlhauser put together, but there's many, right? They all look the same. Life expectancy, GDP per capita, percentage not living in extreme poverty, war-making capacity, energy capture, percentage living in democracy, whatever you like, it all looks flat, right? Even things like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, flat. They're blips. Right? The Black Death killed, I have 10% here. I gave this talk at GMU, and the guy was like, your graph is crap. I'm like, why? Because I did the work, and it was actually a third of Europe. I'm like, okay, fine. Up to a third of Europe dies, right? And maybe like the world closer to this, but it didn't make a dent. It might have laid the foundations for the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. I can say more about that. It doesn't make a dent. But everything really takes off after a very specific event, the Industrial Revolution. We are all living in the shadow of that Industrial Revolution. What I argue is that what is really going on here is a process that we see actually across the biological kingdom. And that is that energy budgets are what make life expand. It is anything that humans can do are expanded upon. Like I can build an IKEA bookshelf with a manual screwdriver, but if I have an electric screwdriver, I can go a lot faster, right? If I want to travel across the globe, I can get on my bicycle, which is an innovation. I'll talk about that in a second. But if I got on a plane, thank God, you guys paid for a flight here. If I had to take a boat, it would have taken me a long time, right? Energy is and it does a few things. First off, you have to have innovations to use that. And what the law of innovation says is that you drive. Economics emerges well after the Industrial Revolution, certainly modern economics. And a lot of it is about how to more efficiently use energy, if you like, or more efficiently do anything. Jeff Bezos is so wealthy because of efficiencies. Right? Because of a vertical alignment. He wipes out high streets as a result of Amazon. And it also incentivizes cooperation. a small offshoot of the British Empire that Cicero described as worthless. You're not going to find anything of value, the British Empire. As a result of changes in Europe that changed cooperation, destroying European tribes, the Catholic Church bans cousin marriage. As a result of these changes, as well as innovations that could put energy to work, builds the largest empire the world has ever seen. Creates a great divergence, and then eventually other countries begin to catch up. The puzzle that I was working on, in 2005, Science Magazine described it as one of the biggest questions of the coming quarter century, top 25. In terms of the laws of life, right, we see this great divergence occur. So, you've got GDP per capita here. I put South Africa here. You can see, sadly, a little bit of a flattening in recent times, but also a bumpy road, right? It goes up, and then it kind of flattens, goes down, then it had a nice period, and then it kind of flattens out, right? There's stuff going on here. But in terms of those laws of life, thinking about what they mean, the law of energy, the law of innovation, what the law of cooperation says is the optimal scale of cooperation that could, in principle, so you have multiple stable equilibria, but the one that is optimal is the one where across at all levels, I get more per energy, per person reward than I would get in a larger or smaller group. So if I'm deciding whether to start a company, what I would love to do is to start a company all by myself and capture that market share and have a unicorn company, but I can't do that. I have to cooperate with other people, with funders, with employees, and I get to the optimal scale where I can capture that market share by perception, right, in expectation. I joke that, by the law of cooperation, economists, it's not like physicists where you need thousands of people to run a scientific experiment. Economists like to keep their papers to no more than 3, because that's the maximum for a Nobel Prize. That's, when the per person reward is higher, the smaller you can go. So there's an incentivization, there's an incentive to do that. So you can see the law of energy in many different places. One of those is simply the correlation between GDP per capita and per capita energy consumption, right? It's an almost perfect correlation, and the deviations are often about cooperation and innovation, right? The way that light bulbs used to be 2 to 7% efficient and now close to 100% with LEDs. This is where South Africa is on that, although I heard about load shedding, and I guess it might be, depends how you want to measure that, I suppose. So that's where South Africa, and here's where nothing is, right? There are no low energy rich countries. Economic growth depends on energy. It depends on energy because it's the hidden source underneath this whole thing. Plus innovations and the ability to work together. So in the book, what I argue is that the problem we face right now is that we haven't had to think about energy because it wasn't the differentiating factor. There was plenty of it to go around. All that really mattered is that we used it more efficiently through innovation and that we cooperated at a sufficiently high scale instead of corruption or whatever. But we have to think about it now because the era of cheap fossil fuels, which are really stored sunlight, by the way, right? It's stored solar energy, photosynthesis, zooplankton and algae turn to oil and natural gas, peat turn to black rock, what we call coal. It's all falling. So if you look at any metric of what's called energy return on investment, right, which is a measure of how much energy it takes to get some amount of energy back, this particular graph is just on discovery rates. In 1919, 1 barrel of oil found you another 1,000 barrels. By 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100, and by 2010, a barrel of oil found you another 5. There's still plenty of energy to go around at the moment, but we're starting to feel the constraint. I refer to the energy ceiling and the efficiency floor as the kind of space of the possible. And that energy ceiling is collapsing on us, and there's a limit to how efficient we can become. And also energy can drive those efficiencies. So we fell off the cliff, right? If you look at total factor productivity, right around the OPEC oil crisis and this artificial constraint, we see the great stagnation emerge. I like how Alex Tabarrok puts it, where he says, if total factor productivity had continued to grow between 1957 and 73, we would be living in the world of 2076, not 2014, as he said it at the time. If we, and I would add to that, and I'd say, if the nuclear age wasn't stillborn, and I think we're back on the timeline on that one, we wouldn't be facing the rise in polarization, the rise of the right wing, and the collapse of our societies today. The second law is the law of innovation, which is simply to say that humans engage so 2 things. One is that when we're competing, when life is competing to eat other animals, take their calories to make more of themselves. There's an energy ceiling by the sun, photosynthesis. Herbivores eat the plants, and the carnivores eat the herbivores. But there's a drive toward doing this more efficiently, right? Faster, bigger muscles, the right size to get away from the predators and eat the prey. But how that happens is specific to the species, the degrees of freedom. And for humans, a lot of the innovation comes from a process of crowd computing, or through a collective process. I won't say too much about that, other than to say that in the book I go through what I call COMPASS, which honestly in hindsight is a terrible acronym that's barely memorable. But it is, the science behind it at least is sound, and you can look at why each of these factors affects the innovation rate. I'll point to a few things actually. So one is just to say that innovation is collective. Second is to say that if you're going to innovate, you have to do something differently. If you keep doing the same thing, you get the same result, right? The magpie strategy, what magpie do in folklore is they go out and they steal shiny things and bring them back to their nest. And the best and easiest way to be creative is to plagiarize. And as they say, taking from one place is plagiarism, but taking from many is just research, right? And there's nothing against plagiarizing policy. Like stealing things that work elsewhere is a very good thing to do. The paradox of diversity is just to say that diversity, by this understanding of innovation, is fuel for innovation. Because if some people see circles and some people see rectangles, they can help you see the circles. They can help you see what you're not seeing. But diversity only works when it is truly inclusive, right? Diversity is by definition divisive. If we don't speak the same language, how can the ideas flow? If I was giving this talk in I'm trying to pick a language, I was going to say German, and I realized you might understand that. If I was giving this talk in French or something, only Etienne would understand, right? You have to have common language, but that's language. Some things don't matter, like food preferences. And other things about work ethic, about whether you should be on time, late, or early, these are coordination problems that you have to solve for diversity to work. I do this with companies, so I run a service line at LSE called Culturalytic, and I think one of the biggest clients we had was Uber. We worked with them. When you work with a company, and this is also true of a country, when you work with a company, you have to work in their ways of working. Like I can't go to Uber and say, hey, I've got this COMPASS strategy. I know you can barely remember it, but the COMPASS strategy, let's just wipe out what you currently do and start something brand new. Uber does what they call big bets. Right? So it's like Google's 20% time. They ask around the company for ideas. So Uber Eats, you have Uber Eats here? Yeah, that was a big bet. Uber Pool, where you jump in a car with a stranger, I don't know if that ever appeared here, but it would be very unpopular here, I imagine. It's very unpopular everywhere. Also a big bet that didn't work out. You just don't like riding cars with strangers. That's why I'm in a car, not a bus. And so we created the 5S strategy. One of them I really like was the 2 pizza rule, stolen from Amazon. They have a 2 pizza rule, but we said 2 different pizzas. So you have people from parts of the company that aren't thinking about the problem, bring them to your meetings just so they are aware of what's going on, and they might have something to contribute. And then you're going to socialize your problem solving. You're going to be able to seek out better solutions from across the company, because prior to that, it was the same people always suggesting things. And Uber reported we couldn't get good, they wouldn't let us have the data, to be honest. But they said, it really helped with the regulatory problems they face in the UK. I want to give you one example of how a country can do this. And it's easier for a smaller country to do. And what happens when you do that? Well, you might not know this, but Estonia, if you look at the PISA scores for reading, so this is the top students around the world in reading, in science, and in mathematics, Estonia is the top of the Western world. They also have raised the most investment per capita in any country and have the highest number of unicorns per company around the world. So what exactly did they do? First off, they realized that the 3 pillars, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Also, there's a 4th pillar, algorithms, and they started teaching it from elementary, from what do you call it, kindergarten, reception. They started teaching it from reception. Like they would program little robots in geography to travel around the world and then talk about that. So it's integrated very deeply. A lot of this, by the way, is available in Estonia, but I flew over there. So this is Linar Vik, who is the head of the Tiger League program, and this is Jaakko Viksu, who was the Minister for Education at the time. And so I got some of this information firsthand, which I write about. They also realized you had to train teachers in how to do this, and you had to localize it. So they incentivized teachers not to have successful solutions, but simply to have new solutions. Steal things from all around the country and all around the world, localize it, and you get a pay bump for doing that. You get a little bonus. And so they created a teacher network TeacherNet, School Life, sorry, it was called, where they shared all this information. They created a collective brain approach. And I argue that that same opportunity is here for South Africa and other countries for AI. AI has the potential to really help us leap ahead in our education systems through personalized education. One of the basic principles behind this kind of collective approach is this idea that if innovation is hard, when you're not at the forefront of technology, it's a bit easier because you steal stuff. But even then, you have to localize it. Where institutions seem to work well is when they ended up getting localized, like Japan and South Korea and Hong Kong. Some systems are well set up for this. So in the United States, Justice Brandeis referred to each state as a laboratory for democracy. And it follows this principle of failing locally and learning globally. What's going on in the Western Cape? Apparently, I saw some GDP numbers. You guys aren't doing better than the rest of the country according to your data. The quality of the data matters, right? Because then you can learn. Every state is trying something different. Here's an example, because it's hard to know in advance the answers to these questions. Should we ban non-compete agreements? I don't know. There's arguments for, there's arguments against. I'm sure there's many econometric papers that can be written about, it harms IP, like the companies, the firm sizes aren't as big as a result of this. Other papers might say, yes, but the idea flow allows new recombination. It's hard to know in advance, honestly, it is. But if you, instead of trying to design new institutions, you allow those institutions to evolve by this principle of diversity and selection. Everybody talks about diversity, but also selection. Diversity and selection. Then you learn something new. Now in California, by some obscure 19th century law, which is here, Article 1673, every contract by which anyone is restrained from exercising a lawful profession, trade, or business of any kind otherwise than is provided by the next two sections is to that extent void. And this meant that non-compete agreements are unenforceable in California. Now this 19th century law didn't know about or didn't expect the tech sector, but the tech sector benefited from it. It meant that if you wanted to take ideas, right, or take IP, you just grabbed the entire team. You just hired them all. And it meant that tech salaries went way up because of this highly competitive environment. And other states began to learn from it. And as of April this year, it is now federal law. Because that's the US, that's the benefit of a federalized system. If it failed, California fails. But if it succeeds, we all benefit. We all learn. Run the experiments. Companies do this too, right? So if you actually look at what Satya Nadella did in Microsoft, he saw a monolith that was unable to innovate. And he said, I want an ecosystem of startups. Same principle, and it worked so well for the share price. It's why they invested, by the way, in OpenAI. It was just a bet. Who knew that it was going to take off? So you can create this startup ecosystem, and the idea is to try to copy and remix best practices and learn from culturally close experiments. In an African context, I'm a big advocate of what I call startup cities. Paul Romer calls these charter cities. For multiple reasons, I do not. One of the reasons is obvious, and I'm not going to say it. The other reason is that it emphasizes the institution too much, as if it's the charter that does the work. But look, there's many business books. We know how to build businesses, and most of them are going to fail. A lot also has to do with the culture. And a startup recognizes that, and that's why I prefer to use the term startup city. Why do I think startup cities matter? Well, first off, it's not clear that we are good at governing ourselves at the scale of a nation state, but we seem okay at the scale of a city state. And the world is increasingly urban, right? I think it's 2007 we passed the 50% threshold. We live in cities now. So we can empower those cities. And the future is also African. Like if you look at the most useful continent and the one that's actually producing humans, and I say this as someone who just lives everywhere all over the place, like we're just producing more humans, the world is African. The future is African. That means something for where we ought to think about where we put our efforts. Startup cities are like engines of development. Does anyone know what this is? Anyone know what this picture is? It's a picture of Hong Kong. But obviously, Hong Kong in 1841, when it was about 8,000 people, fishing villages, right? It was handed over. It was a blank slate, really. Few fishing villages, population about 8,000. This is Hong Kong today. I think it's a similar view I tried to get for you. This is Hong Kong in 1997 when it was given back to China. At this point, it was a world city, 6.5 million people, high human development index, right? You can see it here. That's a little green with, China doesn't look green. There's Hong Kong. In 2001, the rest of China had also gone green in terms of human development. Hong Kong was an engine of development for China. right? When it was handed back in 1997, it represented about 20% of the Chinese economy, right? Today, it represents just 3% of the Chinese economy. I think it's about 2% actually in more recent numbers of the Chinese economy. But China learned from that, and they said, hey, we want more of that, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. Now, not all those experiments succeeded. You know Shenzhen and Guangzhou. You don't know all the other, I barely remember the special economic zones that failed. Most startups are going to fail, but that's the secret to, Silicon Valley is not a bastion of success, it is a graveyard of failure. Those companies, those founders should have taken salaried jobs. But that's what enables it to work, because they're called unicorns because they're so rare. You evolve solutions rather than trying to design them. But you can learn, obviously, right? One of the things I'm very excited about is a new city in Zanzibar. It's very exciting to me because we're trying to, all the things we've learned from the 200 or so, when I say we, the Charter Cities Institute, have learned from the 200 or so new cities around the world, we are implementing there. We're taking a kind of cultural evolutionary approach to it. IIT has created its first international campus there. Leonard Wanchekun, who many of you know, has an ASC campus there. We think of it as like Harvard, MIT, because we're not shy, theory of everyone. And as a result of that, we're building that human talent, and companies then can invest in the Omanis, and so on. And I was recently there, and I had a chance to meet with the Minister for Finance and Investment, and I said, look, here's the job. Here's if I was trying to distill everything we see around these cities, it's very, very simple, actually, right? Create conditions for money to be made. Make sure people have this confidence in a long time frame, right? They can trust that there's money to be made, and just make sure that it splashes around. So it's not a tax haven, it's not an extractive place, it's a place where the locals also benefit, because that's what works with Hong Kong. And so then you get this blend of British and Chinese culture, you get this blend of human capital, of social capital, cultural capital, and so on. We can measure this stuff now, and you can see actually that Hong Kong is literally, culturally, halfway between China and Great Britain. It's literally halfway. Right, which is also the source of its problems these days. So again, my answer to how do we ensure that these development engines succeed is to really think about culture as the invisible cultural pillars. It actually doesn't matter what the Constitution says. It doesn't matter if you have the most fantastic Constitution if you don't believe in rule of law. If you don't believe that we are ruled by principles and not people, by laws and not lords. Right? This is a problem, I think, in foreign policy over and over again. You try to drop in the institutions to Afghanistan, a place with multiple tribes that do not speak the same language who are at each other's throats. It's the wrong scale of cooperation. You can't get it to work. It fails over and over again. If institutions were all that matter, this country that has a flag a lot like America, right? Does anyone know what flag that is? It's Liberia, right? Founded by American slaves who then went on to own their own slaves in Liberia. They took the institutions of America. But they're the opposite end of every metric you might care about, because it's not just the institutions, it's the culture. The culture is key to this. And actually, if you look, there's a great book, The Shenzhen Experiment, and if you look at why Shenzhen worked, the local geography, history, and the culture of the Shenzhen region were essential to its evolution. Wan Du is not a cultural evolution person. I don't even know she knows what cultural evolution is. But independently of that, she's identifying the very same things that this kind of theory of everyone suggests are super important to making any of this stuff work. Creating that startup ecosystem. Oh, I do have slides for Zanzibar. We have a governance handbook if you want to check what we think works, as well as for those who like data, this is the new cities data set, where you can look at all of the metrics. Again, going back to a South African context, there isn't actually a good evidence that people want equality, in the sense that everyone wants equal outcomes. It's not really what people seem to want. What they want is fairness. They don't want the game to be stacked by the happenstance of birth. They want you to have an opportunity where talent, I think one of the things that really motivates a lot of my work is inequality, not for anything to do with moral reasons or fairness or anything like that. It's because we're leaving money on the table. Right? When opportunity and talent are mismatched, we are literally leaving money on the table. All of that wasted human talent, simply because of where you were born or who you were born to, is to me a crime against humanity. It's deeply depressing, right? One of the central pillars of getting this right is something like meritocracy. Does anyone know who that is? Temujin, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, the Khan of Khans, was very successful I'm not saying, like in a broader moral sense, not a moral thought leader here, but successful in terms of pillaging and other bad stuff, in part because he instituted a meritocracy. Temujin was born in a tribe that was an outcast tribe, and he said, I don't care where you're born. I don't care who you were born to. You can rise to the top if you're really good at pillaging, right? You meet my metrics, my KPIs, you're going to the top. And people bought that. They wanted that. He didn't have affirmative action. He just said, I don't care where you're born. Do it, you get there. You get to the top. We see this over and over again. The Chinese civil service exams, right? One of the more controversial things to say in my book is the difference between the United States and China is one party. And I don't mean China has one party. I mean America has one more, right? If you want to change the American system, you have to either change the Democrats or the Republicans. And if you want to change the Chinese system, you have to change the CCP. But they have systems of meritocracy that have been breaking down in recent years. But traditionally, they have systems of meritocracy, like the Chinese civil service exam that goes way, way back, where anyone, anywhere in the country could take this exam, and if they did well, they go straight to the top and they help govern the country. Right? Again, it's this meritocratic system. A lot of the problem, if you take people who are not prepared, you're setting them up for failure. If you target the root cause in terms of their education and the pipeline that causes that failure in the first place, you are actually helping people. You're not just pretending or going through the motions of helping people. You're truly targeting what the issue is. And then it spills over. I used to be worried about things. We were talking over lunch, so I'll just add this here. I used to be worried about things like brain drain, and I honestly changed my mind on it, in part because when there is a market for it, like when you create the conditions where merit flourishes, it creates, that demand creates the supply. In the Philippines, because of the American market for taking Filipino nurses, there was an oversupply of nurses to the Philippines domestic market. In India, because Silicon Valley was grabbing the best engineers, it created a local IT sector. And then those who go to America, but they're not the top tier, they're one tier down, they go back. Because there's money, as long as it's safe and it's not completely extractive, they'll go back. Right? It forges those ties that are absolutely necessary. All right, here's a more controversial thing. I distinguish in the book, wealth is not a problem, right? Billionaires are not a problem. The problem is how that wealth is created. If wealth is created by expanding that space of the possible by the energy ceiling and innovation floor, because you innovated something. Bezos was asked, are you guilty for being so wealthy? He said, listen, I made myself 250 million, but Amazon is worth almost $1 trillion. I made everybody else 850, or it was over $1 trillion. I made other people so much money. I expanded the system. There is a difference between, wealth that is wealth creation and wealth that is wealth appropriation. These are both ways to make money: innovation, shareholding, salaried jobs, entrepreneurship, business, and property leasing, multi-generational wealth transfers, land owning, nepotism, cronyism. But they're both ways to make money. But one makes everyone else richer and one makes everyone else poorer in relative terms. Right? One expands the space of the possible, the other is simply rent-seeking. And one of the things that I come down on, I didn't really know too much about it until I was thinking about what would work here, is land value taxes, Henry George's idea, right? There's something special about lands. There is a trickiness to taxes and redistribution, because many of the ways that we tax and we redistribute are distortionary. They harm the system. They lead to cobra effects. They lead to cane toad effects, right? What do you want to, oh damn it, the answer is there with it. What do you want to do when you want to reduce something? Tax it. So let me ask you a question. Why do we tax income and sales? Do we want people to work less? These are new things, right? One lesson from the book is that we were born into a world that we just accepted. But the world doesn't have to be this way. I didn't show you a chart, but the Flynn effect, IQ test scores are rising. The world was not only created by people no smarter than us, but actually less smart. Change is possible. It always has been a small group of people who were motivated and resourced who chose to change things, right? In the US, I tried to find South Africa's numbers, by the way. The US income tax and sales tax around the same time emerged in 1913, South Africa in 1914. And do you know what it was? It was 1%. On, in today's money, 100,000 or more you paid 1% on, which represented 3% of the population paying income tax. The maximum tax rate was 7% on people making over $16 million in today's money. But the government introduces something, and then it's hard to let go, It starts to expand, you get a bit more money, you get used to it. It's hard to let it go. Most taxes are distortionary except land, because land is fixed and it's the one asset that we own that we did not create. Not recreate, create. Right? It's the one asset that we did not create. Right? Art, patents, businesses, all of these can go up and down based on true value, like actually you make money when you create win-win situations, you make money when you create a situation that makes other people wealthy, except the land. You can't make more of the land, you can't make less, so by taxing it, it's non-distortion in any way. But by taxing the underlying value of the land, you incentivize people to efficiently use it as long as the planning regulations don't get in the way. And it has multiple advantages. It is redistributionary in a non-distortionary way. Because for one, you can't evade it. I'm going to put my land into a trust. Well, that's fine. The trust has to pay the tax. I'm going to put my tax into my land into a business. Well, that's fine. You can't take your land with you to the Bahamas. The land is the land. Somebody owns it. Somebody pays the tax. And you don't need it to be very high, 1, 2, 3%, to make a whole lot. And a lot of this, people are like, well, what about my house? What about my farm? That's not what's valuable. What's valuable are the mines. What's valuable those are where most of the money is going to come from. And it disincentivizes just holding on to this. And over time, history doesn't have to define the future, but we have a problem because history has created current circumstances that are so entrenched that they lead to handouts to friends and freebies to groups that were underprivileged, but they don't target the underlying problem. But if you have something like land value taxes, over time, the system fixes itself without harming the system. In the book, I talk about Norway. So it's naturally redistributed and it targets resources. It's fair and non-distortionary. I talk about Norway. And so when Norway discovered oil in the North Sea, 1969, they implemented what they call the Norway's 10 oil commandments, as well as other legislation that prevented this from being misused. Because they understood the resource curse. The DRC is very wealthy, and so is South Africa. But that doesn't mean everyone in South Africa is wealthy. But every Norwegian is a millionaire. Right? I tried to catch up on my local politics in South Africa. Ramaphosa is talking about implementing a sovereign wealth fund. That should be pushed through. But he's like, we're not ready yet. Yeah, you're never ready yet. You got to push this through. Land. So one of the problems is, let's say you're taxing land. Where does the money go? Where does the money go? What Norway said in its 10 oil commandments. What have I got here? Oh yeah, so you can actually see the effect of this, right? So this is the Scandinavian countries, and as well, I threw in UK and Germany just as a bit of a contrast. You can see there's not a massive difference. And then Norway discovers oil, and it just shoots off. Now, it didn't have to go that way. Britain also discovered oil, but it put it into like tax breaks and more money for the wealthy. Norway said, you can use that money, but it is going to, this is Nikolai Tangen, who's the current CEO. I had the pleasure of supervising his master's dissertation. I highly recommend this TED Talk, Why Every Norwegian is a Millionaire. So there's a few things. One is that it can only be used for certain things, education, roads, a handful of things, healthcare, and nothing more. You can only use the interest and not the capital on it. And as a result of that, because they have an infinite time horizon, when the 2008 crisis, they said, as Nikolai puts it, they invested, they struck oil again because they bought up what was available on sale during 2008. They now own about 2% of the world stock market. This tiny country owns about 2%, 1/50th of the world stock market. And it's because they had this legislation that constrained people. So I think there's a lesson there for South Africa. So just to say that on corruption, cooperation and corruption are two sides of the same coin. What I often say is that corruption is not a puzzle to be solved. It is the most natural thing in the world. There are many mechanisms that have been identified for understanding why we cooperate. Genes that can identify and favor copies of themselves. Direct reciprocity. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Indirect reciprocity like reputation. All of these are so natural. What is surprising in religion and so on, what is surprising is that these don't undermine institutions everywhere in the world. Like, how is it that this seems to work? So what undermines cooperation? It is these things. What we call nepotism is inclusive fitness undermining our institutions. What we call cronyism is direct or indirect reciprocity. It's well understood mechanisms undermining the meritocracy. But if cooperation undermines cooperation, how do we get there? Part of that is that Europe suppresses that lower level, and energy incentivized us to go higher. So if you look at what works in anti-corruption, it's just two things. It's undermining lower scales and incentivizing higher scales. In The Weirdest People in the World and a related science paper by Jonathan Schultz, Dumanrad, Beauchamp, and Henrik, what they show is that the Catholic Church banning cousin marriage destroyed European tribes. Cousin marriage is the norm. What it creates are tribes of people, and not, instead of family trees, you can have family webs. Your uncle is now related to you by multiple things, and those allow for cooperation at a kin level at a much higher scale. People favor their own ethnicity, and it undermines states. Because you don't put the best person in power, you put your person in power because you know there's rewards to be gained. So if you look at, for example, this is the centuries of exposure to the Western Church and cousin marriage. You can see that relationship. And then if you look at the cousin marriage and you look at something like generalized fairness, right? The more cousin marriage you have, the less fairness you have. And if you look at the work on, Robert Klickardt's work, for example, on controlling corruption, transparency can backfire, but things like cooling down periods on a revolving door, they're undermining direct reciprocity. Incentivize independent authorities. All of these things work under these very same principles. One last thing, I'll say is that zero-sumness, perceptions of zero-sumness matter. When we believe that the world is positive sum and you do something good, I can learn from you. You start a coffee shop, I go, coffee shop is booming, let me do the same thing. But if you start a coffee shop and I believe the world is zero sum, I'm going to burn your coffee shop down because we're in competition with one another. Johan, not your coffee shop specifically, but you never know. Multiculturalism is really hard to get right. But if you look at, for example, refugees in, I think it's in Uganda, people welcome them when they come with resources. But when they come and they threaten, already full schools and hospitals and so on, people are resentful. Right? And so, there's different models where you leave people alone in the mosaic model, you try to integrate them in the melting pot. I argue for an umbrella model where you realize, look, we're all under the same umbrella, and if we fight over this, we're all outside in the rain. And resources matter so much to this, as well as, fairness and so on. The take-homes are, think about the systems level, steal your solutions from all over the world, wherever that might be. Remember that diversity allows you to see circles, or rectangles, depending on how you grow up. And you need the people who see the world very differently. Energy, infrastructure, housing, and education, that's the core of this whole system. I'm in the UK, which is known for its economic and political stability. Someone told me, like, is it Joburg or something, had seven mayors in 8 years? I'm like, please, we had 3 prime ministers in 1 year. There's a great document by some people I know actually on foundations, which emphasizes basically these things. You have to solve those. Energy, infrastructure, housing, and education. That's the core of the whole thing. Just to say that I have a couple of companies that I work with, and when I founded the London School of Artificial Intelligence, just to personalize education, I would like to, if people are interested in implementing this in a South African context, I'd be happy to talk about them. This is a Guardian piece I wrote about it. One last point. You can't fix something if you can't talk about it freely and openly. You can't write new cultural software. You can't review the code. That requires trust. It requires psychological safety. One of the great benefits of the United States is the First and Second Amendment, right? The ability to speak freely about things. That creates discomfort. It creates trouble. It creates hate speech. But it also allows for innovation. It allows for progress. And it allows for an unusually large footprint for what is just another country. All I want to say is we inherited a world created by people no smarter than us, but history is not destiny unless you treat it that way. Thank you for having me.